Let's go Ravens! What if one of the biggest stories surrounding the Ravens right now isn't about a rookie, isn't about a new coach, and isn't even about a major free agent move? What if it's about a player who has already spent years helping define this football team? Because over the past several months, Ravens fans have been asking the same question over and over again. What's next for Marlon Humphrey? At one point, some people thought his future in Baltimore was uncertain. Others believed the Ravens would never seriously consider moving on. Then something interesting happened. The noise started to disappear. The rumors slowed down. The speculation cooled off. But the questions never went away. And now, after a long period of silence, we're starting to get a clearer picture of where things stand. The problem is, the answers may create even bigger questions. Because this story isn't just about whether Marlon Humphrey is on the roster today. It's about what happens tomorrow. It's about what happens after this season. And it's about whether one of the most recognizable players on this team is approaching the most important year of his Ravens career. Before we continue, make sure you've already hit the like button if you believe Marlon Humphrey still has plenty of great football left in him. And let's get some positive energy rolling through Ravens flock today. Comment below. Go Ravens! Marlon still has more to prove. I want to see how many Ravens fans are still confident that number 44 can remind everyone exactly why he's been such an important part of this organization. Now, my opinion on this entire situation is actually very balanced. Based on the information being discussed, I don't think the biggest question is whether Marlon Humphrey can help this team right now. The Ravens had opportunities to create cap space and move in a different direction, but they chose not to. To me, that's significant. It suggests they still believe he brings value to this roster. The bigger question is what happens after this season. That's where things become much more difficult. Because the discussion keeps coming back to one thing, performance. If Marlon Humphrey has the kind of season his supporters expect, the conversation could completely change. If not, the Ravens may eventually face a decision that many fans have been trying to avoid thinking about. And after what we've recently learned, this story may be far from over. Let's see how many members of Ravens flock believe number 44 can continue proving people wrong. Now, my opinion on this situation is actually very simple. Based on the information being discussed, I think this season feels like a turning point for Marlon Humphrey. Not because anyone has decided his future already, but because so much appears to depend on what happens next. The discussion repeatedly comes back to the same idea, performance. If he continues playing at a high level, the conversation looks one way. If things change, the conversation looks completely different. What stands out most to me is that the organization chose not to create another hole on the roster when they had the opportunity. That tells me they still see value in what Marlon Humphrey brings to this team. But whether that value extends far beyond this season may depend on what happens once the games actually begin. What makes this situation so fascinating, Ravens fans, is that the discussion has evolved far beyond simple questions about cap space. Earlier in the offseason, many people focused on the financial side of things. They looked at the potential savings and wondered whether the Ravens would decide to move on. But according to the discussion, the organization chose a different path. Eric DeCosta previously indicated that the plan was to keep Marlon Humphrey on the roster, and ultimately that's exactly what happened. Now that we're moving deeper into the offseason, the conversation has shifted. It's no longer about whether Marlon Humphrey would survive the offseason. It's about what kind of role he could play moving forward and what his future could look like beyond this season. One of the reasons fans continued asking questions was because they hadn't seen much of Humphrey during off-season activities. Naturally, that created speculation. Whenever a high-profile player isn't seen regularly, people start wondering if something is happening behind the scenes. But then Ravens Media Day arrived, and Humphrey's presence immediately became one of the talking points. The material highlights how Humphrey was back in the building and interacting with teammates, including Jacoby Lane. That may seem like a small detail on the surface, but after weeks of questions and uncertainty from fans, simply seeing him involved became noteworthy. And honestly, that's part of what makes Marlon Humphrey such a unique figure around the Ravens. The discussion points out that he has always had a strong personality. Whether it's through his comments, his opinions, or his interactions with teammates, he tends to make his presence felt. Even during Media Day, he managed to spark conversation with his opinion about the Ravens uniforms. That's just part of who he is. But when the conversation turned toward football, an even bigger question emerged. What happens after this season? That's where things become much less certain. The argument presented throughout the discussion is that this upcoming season could end up determining a lot about Humphrey's future in Baltimore. Not because anyone has already made a decision, but because performance remains the biggest factor. How he plays, how he fits into the new defensive structure, how effective he remains at his current position. All of those factors could influence what comes next. Another interesting point raised is that Humphrey still appears to have significant support within the organization. The discussion specifically emphasizes the respect and appreciation he has earned throughout his years with the Ravens. He's been part of important moments, he's been with the organization through multiple phases, and he remains a player who is viewed positively within the building. That matters, because football decisions are often about more than statistics alone. Relationships matter. Leadership matters. History with the organization matters. And according to the discussion, Humphrey has built plenty of goodwill during his time in Baltimore. Then another fascinating possibility entered the conversation. What if Humphrey eventually transitions to safety? The idea raised was that if he ever begins slowing down at cornerback, his physical style of play, tackling ability, and ball skills could potentially make him an intriguing candidate for a different role. The discussion even suggested that such a transition could be very natural for him because of the way he already plays the game. Of course, that creates its own complications. The discussion points out that Baltimore already has players at the safety position, which means any potential position change would create a completely different set of questions. That's why this remains more of a hypothetical scenario than anything concrete. Still, the fact that these conversations are happening shows how much uncertainty surrounds Humphrey's long-term future. Not necessarily uncertainty about this year, but uncertainty about what comes after it. For now, though, the biggest takeaway remains simple. Marlon Humphrey is still here. The Ravens chose not to create another hole on the roster. The organization appears willing to give this situation another season to play out. And now the spotlight turns toward what Humphrey does once the games begin. Because if he plays at the level many fans know he's capable of, the entire conversation could change. And if that happens, some of the same people who questioned his future this offseason may end up having a very different opinion by the end of the year. What makes the next few months so important is that they could answer questions that Ravens fans have been debating for a very long time. Because when you really look at the discussion surrounding Marlon Humphrey, there seem to be two completely different groups of people. One group sees a player who has been through everything with this organization. A player who has remained a major part of the team for years. A player who has earned respect inside the building and continues to be valued by the Ravens. The other group looks at the future. They look at age. They look at roster construction. They look at younger players emerging. And they wonder whether Baltimore will eventually decide it's time to move in a different direction. That's why this upcoming season feels so significant. It's not just another season for Marlon Humphrey. It's a season that could shape the rest of his Ravens career. And one thing that stood out in the discussion was the idea that the Ravens did not want to create another weakness by moving on from him. That's an important point, because sometimes fans look at one player in isolation. Teams don't. Teams look at the entire roster. If you remove one player, who replaces him? If that player leaves, what problem are you creating somewhere else? Those are the kinds of questions front offices have to answer. And according to the discussion, one of the strongest arguments for keeping Humphrey was avoiding the creation of another major question mark within the secondary. Now the pressure shifts. Not necessarily pressure created by the fans. Not necessarily pressure created by the media. But pressure created by opportunity. Because Humphrey now has a chance to remind everyone exactly why the Ravens chose to keep him around. That's why I find the timing of all this so interesting. After months of questions. After months of speculation. After months of fans wondering what was happening, the conversation has finally arrived at the point where only one